Today we're going to learn Shabbat Daf Kuf Nun Hey. Today's daf is dedicated in memory of Rabbanit Steinsaltz, who passed away today. It's a huge loss for the Jewish people. Rabbi Steinsaltz was the leading person in our generation to make Talmud accessible to the masses. He really did amazing work in that way, from his commentary Steinsaltz, his reference guide. Due to him, we are enabled to learn the way we learn today. And as I said, it's really a huge loss. Okay, we are going to start. Just before we start, I want to make a few announcements, reminding everyone about the Siyum on Sunday night. On Sunday morning, we're going to learn as usual in the morning. Sunday night, we're going to finish. Monday, there will be no regular class. If you signed up and didn't yet receive a link, please let us know. We'll be sending out source sheets on Sunday also, so check your spam because sometimes it might go into spam. So please, everybody, look in your spam folders if you're registered. The event will be on Facebook Live. It'll be recorded. It'll be up on our site by Monday morning if you can't make it to the Siyum and want to watch also. Okay, we're going to get started. We finished, and I put it on the sheet for today, with the Machloket Abaye and Rabbah about whether one can use the sides of an animal or not. And then we applied that also to a tree, that whatever would be true for an animal would be true for using the sides of a tree. We brought in the sukkah example, and then we said, maybe it's a machloket tanaim, the debate between them. Abaye says no, Rabbah says yes. And then we had, and because it was at the end of class, I don't think I was careful about pointing this out, but we then said that there was a machloket tanaim, and it must be the same, because one says stadim is okay, and one says it's not, and that's why whether you can go into the sukkah or not was a machloket. Abaye said no. Everyone agrees that stadim is asur. Here we're talking about date stadim. It's indirect of indirect. Okay, already it's much more removed. Rava said no. If you hold direct as asur, then you hold. If you hold stadim as asur, then you hold once. Once it's indirect, it doesn't matter how indirect. This is Rava, not Rabba. That's what I wanted to clarify. It's not the same person. Rava was a contemporary of Abaye and not his adopted father. So Rava said it's all the same. If you say stadim is forbidden, then stadim is asur. And that's where we're going to start with a question on Rava. Last 5 words on Kuf Nun Dal and Amabet. Eitive Rav Mishar Shiel Rava. He brought up the following issue. It says in a Tannaitic source, Na'atz yate bi'ilam v'talaba kilkala. The issue here is Eruv Tchumin. We're going to get to this more in Eruvin, but if you want to go more than 2,000 amma outside the city, you can do that under the condition that you put food down in a certain place, and then you say, that's where I plan to be for Shabbat, even if you're not really there, but if the food is there when Shabbat starts, and then you can go 2,000 amma from there. The food has to be accessible to you, and when we say accessible, it means it has to be in the same domain as you. So it says here, if you put a peg into a tree, v'talaba kilkala, and you hung a basket, and you put your food of your Eruv in that basket. If it's lamala ma'asara tvachim, if it's 10 tvachim off the ground, remember 10 tvachim off the ground is already a different reshut if it's in a public space. Ein eruvo eruv, then your eruv doesn't count. Lamata ma'asara tvachim eruvo eruv. But if it's less than 10 tvachim off the ground, then it works. So now what do you notice it said here? We weren't really paying attention to this detail, but it said, Tama dena atziate bi'ilan. It's because you put it on a peg, and from the peg is the basket, and the food is in the basket. It sounds like if you didn't put the peg, and you just put the basket, attached it to the wall, why not? What do you see here? What do you see here? You see that if it's next to it, it's going to be if it's next to the tree, up against the tree, it's a problem. But if it's attached to the peg that's attached to the tree, that's already stadim. And when you see here that there's a distinction, even though one is allowed, the other isn't. Again, it's from an inference. Comes Rav Papa and he says, no, I'm a Rav Papa. This isn't a case of using the sides of the tree. This is a case of actually using the tree, because what we mean is it's a basket that's very small. When you it has a very small opening. When you put your hand in to try to get the food, what's going to happen? It's going to shake the tree. If it shakes the tree, then you're actually using the tree itself. You're not using the stadim of the tree, the side of the tree. You're using the tree itself. That's why it's a problem. And now the Gemara says, "V'hilchatat stadin asurin, sidet stadin mutarin." Okay, the sides of the tree are problematic, but something attached to the tree and you want to use that, that's already allowed. What's a great example of this? A hammock. If you hang a hammock, you hang it usually on a peg sticking out or something sticking out of the tree, then it's going to be allowed to be used. And Rav Re'em Kohen Paskin's based on this. He says, Tzidei Tzadim, that's a case of Tzidei Tzadim, and you can use a hammock on Shabbat. Other people claim, maybe there's issues with hammock, but he says, from Yeshivat O'Neill, he says there's no problem with hammocks on Shabbat because it's Tzidei Tzadim. Amar Rav Ashi, Hashad Amar Tzadin Asurin, Hai Darga de Midla, Lo Ninkeinish, Adikla. If you have a ladder going up to you have something high up, you have a ladder and it's right near a tree, you can't lean the ladder up against a tree. Lo Ninkeinish Adikla. You can't lean it up against a tree because you're using it to have a leit stadim. Ela, so what can you do? Linche agavaze levar midikla. You can put it on the outside on something attached to the tree, something sticking out, a peg sticking out of the tree, it can lean on that. The chisalik, and when you go up, lo linach kare agavazai, don't lean on the pegs, ela linach hakani, lean on the rungs of the ladder. What's the best example of this relevant? A treehouse. When you build a treehouse, if you want to be able to use it on Shabbat, make sure that the ladder of the treehouse isn't leaning directly up against the tree. If it's leaning up against the tree, then you're going to have an issue using it on Shabbat. Mishnah starts out, Mitilin piki'e amir lifnei behema. We're now moving topics. Talk about feeding animals on Shabbat. So you can untie bundles of wheat or something, bundles, before in front of an animal. The assumption is the animal's eating these stalks, right, the straw. Umefasfesin et hakipin, you can scatter out the kifin. We don't know what this is yet. Avalo et hazirin. So kifin you can scatter, you can't scatter zirin. Notice it doesn't talk about mitirim, untying. It's not so clear. Ein merazkim, you can't crush, lo et hashachat, not hay, below et haruvin, and not carob, lifnei behema. Bein daka, bein gasa. It doesn't matter if the animal's small or large. Small we mean sheep and goats. Large we mean cows and oxen and those kinds. Now, what's the difference? Well, behemot gasot, it's easier for them to eat. So they can eat things even if they're harder. Whereas for smaller animals, it's harder for them to eat things that are very hard. But it says here, you can't crush them up for either one. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'charuvim l'daka. He allows charuvim for the smaller animal. Amar Rav Huna. So now we have to explain, and we're going to have two different explanations of what these cases are in the Mishnah, what kifin and what pekin. You can follow in the chart, it'll help. Amar Rav Huna. Hein pekin, hein kifin. They're really one and the same. Pekin tre, kifin tlata. What pekin is a bundle of 2, and kifin is a bundle of 3. What's the difference? So we'll see. So zirin arze. Zirin is cedar, moist stalks of a cedar tree. And this is the way the Mishnah should read. You can untie a bundle of 2. Some people say, by the way, it's either 2 stalks or it could be two ties around it. So you can undo 2 of them before a behema if you want to feed the animal. And you can even scatter them. And you can even scatter keeping, untie them and scatter them. Avaloet hazirin, but you can't do that for the cedar. Lo lefasfes v'lo lahatir. You can't scatter and you can't untie. Why is this? Amar Rav Chisda, my time of Rav Huna. What's his logic? You're allowed to deal with food. Once something's called food, you can do whatever you want with it. So once it's untied, you can also scatter it, no problem. But if you want to turn something into food, and the idea is that the cedar was generally used for burning. It wasn't really used for food for an animal. If you want to make a food for an animal, you want to untie it and put it in front of the animal, that's not allowed because that's what we call nolad. You're creating something that didn't exist before Shabbat. It wasn't food for an animal before Shabbat, and therefore you're not allowed to. That's what he explains. Rabbi Yehuda Amar, hein pekin, hein zirin. Pekin and zirin are the same thing. Pekin tre, zirin tlata. Pekin is 2, zirin is 3. Kifin de arze, and kifin is for the cedar. So not zirin, but kifin, according to this. V'hachi kamar. So now we have to read the Mishnah and explain it. Mitirim pki'ei amir lefnei ha'behema, aval pisfusei lo. You're allowed to untie them, but you can't scatter them. Okay, the assumption here is that once you open them, they're already ready. Once you untie them, they can be eaten just like that, because there's only 2. The kifin, pispuse nami mefasfasinan. Now, if you have the cedar, you can untie it and scatter it. Aval lo hazirin lefasfes ela lahatir. The zirin, there are 3, you also can't scatter them. You can untie them, but not scatter them. So Amar Rava, my time de Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Why is he going to be more lenient with scattering the cedar when it's much less likely to be eating it? So he holds kasavar shave ochle mashvinan mitrach be'ochle lo tarchinan. You can turn something into food, but you can't work with food once it's food. He says the exact opposite. To say we want to give my animal food and this wasn't food yesterday, it's going to be food today, that we allow because you need food for your animal. But once something's already food, we don't allow you to work anymore to deal with it. It's already food and the animal can get to it. Don't make it any easier for him. That's called tirchi yatera, an unnecessary, burdensome activity. So because of that, once we call it food and you already untied it, we don't allow you to scatter it. Tanan. Now we're going to have a problem from our Mishnah. It says, we're now going to have a few questions on Rav Huna's approach. Remember, Rav Huna said, we allow you to deal with food once it's food, but we don't allow you to turn something into food. So you can't crush up the shachad, it said in the Mishnah. You can't crush up the hay or the straw and the carobs before an animal. Doesn't matter whether it's large or small animal. My love charuvin dumi at the shachad. We're going to see this a few times today, and we saw this also in previous shiurim, that when two things are next to each other in a source, Tanaitic source, we're going to assume that they're supposed to be similar one to another. So charuvim must be like shachat. Mas shachat dirachiche, just like shachat, the straw is soft and edible. Af charuvim dirachiche, it must be soft and edible. Alma, what do you see here? Lo tarchina be'uchla. Once it's edible, we don't allow you to crush it anymore to make it more edible because it's already edible. The animal can eat it. We don't let you bother. Uti ute de Rav Huna, and this goes against Rav Huna. So Amar lecha Rav Huna, lo. We can say the exact opposite. Shachad dumiyad charuvim. We could say it's the shachad is like the carobs. Ma charuvim da akushe af shachad da akushe. Just like the carobs are hard, likewise the straw must be hard straw. So now they say hechi ash mishkachalai. How could it be hard straw? Right? It's always edible for animals. Be'ile zutre. We're talking about small animals. Like even it means small donkeys. Small donkeys. That even eating straw is difficult for them, and therefore you're allowed. The issue is you want to try to crush it, okay? So that's the issue, and that explains the question that we're basically going to say it's hard and it wasn't edible, and you're basically making it edible for the animal, okay? So then, right, so now, according to this, 1 second, we're going to say, right, they're hard. Right, Rav Huna will say it's hard, and that's why you can't do it. Right, that's his whole thing. He says you can't turn something into food. That's the whole idea. So therefore, since it's hard and it can't be eaten by this animal, you're not allowed to crush it up. Tashma, second source against Rav Huna. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'charuvin, same source. It says in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda allows charuvin l'daka for small animals. So it sounds like l'daka in l'gasalo. It sounds like only for small animals, not for large animals. So, if you say the Tanakama Savar mitrach be'uchla lo tarchinan shivuye mashvinan, Tanakama holds what? Right, we're going to see Tanakama versus Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda's understanding. It's going to work for his opinion. If you say, don't confuse Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the Amora explaining the Machloka Tanaim of Rabbi Yehuda and Tanakama. So Tanakama holds, you can deal with food once it's food, but I'm sorry, you can't deal with food. This is Rabbi Yehuda's approach. You can't deal with food once it's food, but you can turn something into food. Then, Hainu dekama Rabbi Yehuda, charuvim ledaka nami shivuya ochlehu. Rabbi Yehuda comes and says to Tanakama, well, that's why we should allow the charuvim for behemah daka, because for behemah daka, he can't eat those charuvim, so we should allow you to be able to crush them to turn them into food. But Ella, Iyamar Tanakama Savar, but if you want to hold like Rav Huna, who says, Shavia uchla lo mashvinan, but mitrach be'uchla mitakrina. Once it's food, you can do whatever you want with it, but you can't turn something into food. So Rabbi Yehuda dematir b'charuvin ledaka kol sheken legasa. If he allows it for a daka, because once it's food, you can do whatever you want with it. If it's food for a daka, then all the more so it's food for gasa, and it should be allowed for both. Mis savar daka daka mamash. So how do they answer this according to Rav Huna? Daka doesn't really mean what you think it means. Daka doesn't mean small animal like it usually does. My daka gasa. When they say daka, they really mean a large animal. Since it's already food, you're allowed to crush it. So now he says, umay karile daka. How could you say daka is gasa? Why do they call it daka? Dedaika ba'uchla. Okay, but he's He's careful about his food. He chews it very well. Okay, now, this sounds very difficult. The Gemara is going to say, what do you mean though? But Hamid Katani Resha, the line right before it said, Bein Dakau, Bein Gasa, whether it's large or whether it's small, whether it's large. Which means that Daka and Gasa really do mean Daka and Gasa. Michlad Rabbi Yehuda Daka Daka Mamash. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says, just for the Daka, he sounds like he's talking about the large animal. And in fact, the Gemara says Kasha. This source, in fact, is difficult according to Rav Huna. Tashma, next source. You can cut gourd in front of an animal. Okay, now gourd is generally meant for humans. Remember we learned before that Rabbi Yehuda's Machmir Muktzah and says if it's meant for humans, animals can't eat it on Shabbat because you didn't designate it for animals, but we generally hold like Rabbi Shimon that you can. So therefore, you can cut tluim lifnei abema, lifnei klavim, and if an animal died, even though generally the animal is meant for humans, but once it dies and can't be shefted anymore, then you could give it to your animals. But notice the focus of it. It says mechatchim, you can cut them up. So my lav tluim dumia de nevela. Again, we're going to say because these appear together, they must be the same. Just like nevela, ma nevela derechicha. Just like nevela is soft and edible. Afteluim derekike. It must be gourds that are soft. We know gourds are often very hard when they're raw. This must have been a soft one, and that's why we allow it. Ama tarchina ba'uchla. What does this seem to imply? These were edible, and yet we allow you to deal with them. That seems to go. Now, finally, we're bringing a question on Rav Yehuda's shita. So, tiyuvta de Rav Yehuda. It's a problem for Rav Yehuda. Amar l'cha Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda will answer, lo, nevela dumia de deluim. We're talking about a nevela that's like the pumpkin. It's the opposite, like the gourd. Madluim da ashune. Just like they're generally hard. Af nevela da ashune. It's a nevela that's very hard. Now the Gemara asks, well, hechidami. And then we're going to say, that's why you can cut them because you're turning them into food, and that matches Rav Yehuda. Now they say, where do you have a case of hard nevela that's inedible? So they say the basar pile, the meat of an elephant is very tough. Inami beguriata zutre, or maybe we're talking about little puppies. Little puppies can't eat general meat. You have to cut it up for them. So maybe it means that. And then again, that would explain why Rav Yehuda says this is all turning it into food. It's making it edible. And that's why it's allowed. But once it's already food, you can't deal with it. Tashma, last source. Titane Rav Chanan min hardam b'farchinan tevin v'asfasta. You can crumble straw and alfalfa, arvin, and you can mix them together to give to your animal. Amar tochinam ba'uchla. Here you see, you can deal with food, right? This goes against Rav Yehuda again. So they say, Tevin betiv nesaria asfasta be'ile zutre. We're talking about tevin. We mean straw that's rotten, and that's why you're breaking it into little pieces, I guess to get rid of the rotten part, to make it edible. And asfasta, you could say alfalfa when you're talking about little animals that need it broken up in order to be able to eat it. Okay. Now we're going to talk about other things people could do with animals, and are you allowed to feed animals on Shabbat? Are you not allowed to? Which animals can be fed? How can they be fed? Can you force feed animals? Ein of simitagama. You can't force feed a camel on Shabbat. Again, the issue is tircha yetera. It's too much work. We don't want you to work so hard. You're not allowed to do this. Normally, if they were going on a journey, they would fill up the camel. A camel can keep its food for many days with tons of food. They would force feed it so that the food would last the camel for many days. You can't do this on Shabbat. Below dorsin, and you also can't put food in its mouth. Rashi says it's just less strong than ofsin. Okay, so not only ofsin you can't do, you can't also do dorsin, push food in its mouth. Avam malitim, but you can do malitim, which we're going to see what this is. Ve'en ma'amirin et agalim avam malitim. You can't do ma'amirin to the agalim, but you can do halata le'itim, which we're going to have to understand the Gemara what this is. We don't really know what this is, but these are all sort of feedings that we feed the animal. We'll see in different ways. Umahalkatin the tarnagolim. Mahalkatin is actually more than malitim. Mahalkatin, the hay is like a hitpa'el. It means you're doing it with more strength, it seems like here. Mahalkatim the tarnagolim. Again, we're going to have to see in the Gemara what this is. Vinotnim, mayim for the roosters. Vinotnim, mayim lemursan. You could put water into the bran. What would be the issue? Avalogovlim. You can't knead it. Even though when you put the water into the bran, it's like making oatmeal. It thickens, but you're allowed to do it as long as you don't mix it up. And that was something they would do for the tarnagolim, for the roosters. You can't put out water for bees and for birds that are in a nest. In a dovecote, but you can't put in front of ducks and roosters. You You can do it in front of the yonim that are called the yonei hardisaot, which is either comes from Herod. He had these types of birds that people would breed in their houses, or it's from rodus, from roads, okay? Hardisaot from roads, a certain type that came from Greece that we used for these purposes. The main difference, it seems like, and we'll see this in the Gemara, is that you're responsible to feed them as opposed to the ones that are out in the wild. My enosim. So the Gemara wants to know, what is this? Amar Rav Yehuda, enosim la'ivus b'toch me'eha. You can't make a trough in its insides. Basically, putting the trough is where they fed the animal from. You can't basically create a trough inside the animal because it's too much work on Shabbat. Mika ki agavna. Does anybody really do this? Right? Thankfully, the Gemara says, what kind of a crazy thing is this? It is. Uchida Amar Rav Yirmiyah Difti. He said, Ledidi chazi le'ahutaya. I once saw an Arab merchant. To achla kuravat inakura. He fed it a core, which is a huge amount, and then he put another core on the camel to have the camel carry the next batch of food it was going to need. Ein ma'amirin. So now we want to understand what all these terms are. Ezu hamra'a, ehi hamra'a, ve'ezi hi halata. Amar Rav Yehuda, hamra'a lemakom she'ena yichola lachzir. Halata lemakom she'chola lachzir. Remember what it said. You can't be ma'amir, the agalin, the foals, but you can be malitim. So what's the difference? It's about how much you shove it down. If you shove it to a place where it can't come up anymore, that's forbidden. If you get it to a place in the mouth, not down the throat, then it's going to be allowed. So Rav Chisda, he has a different explanation. That was Rav Yehuda. Rav Chisda says, both of them are a place where it's all the way in. Hamra'a b'kli, halata b'yad. You can do it with your hand. You can't do it with an implement. Mativ Rav Yosef. So now Rav Yosef's going to question. He's going to say like this. It says, Mehalkatim, we're now quoting the Tosefta. In the Tosefta, it says, Mehalkatim l'tarnagolim ve'ein sarich lamar shemalkatim. I told you Mehalkatim is more. It's more severe. But we still allow that for tarnagolim. Obviously, we also allow malkitim. Ve'ein malkitim liyonei shovach liyonei aliyah ve'ein sarich lamar she'ein mehalkatim. But for the yonei shovach and liyonei aliyah, the ones living in the dove coats, those or on top of high places, or in the rooftops, those you can't do malkitim even, and obviously you also can't do mahalkitim. So now obviously we're going to ask, my mahalkitim or my malkitim. Ilem, if you want to say mahalkitim is desafe lebiyadayim, that you put the food out by hand, just put it in front of them. And malkitim is, desafe lebiyadayim, you feed the animal with your hands, force feed. Umalkitim is dishadele kamayu. You just put it out in front of him. Michlal, from here you can infer that yonei shavach yonei aliyah mishta kamayu namilo. Remember, neither was allowed. You can't put food in front of them. That seems so odd. You're not actually feeding them. Feeding them, I could see, but to just put some food down on the ground, elalav. So therefore, it can't be that that's the case because that makes no sense. It must be, and then from this we're going to have a question. And one of the opinions we saw. Mehalkatim must be lemakom she'ena yichola lachzir. It must be you shove it down his throat too far, right? A place where it can't come back again. Malkitim is lemakom she'chola lachzir. Malkitim is still in his throat, in his mouth, where he can spit it out if he wants. Michlal, from here one can infer what? Dehamra'a, in other words, if this is mahalkatim and that's malkitim, we still need another level. What's that other level? Hamra'a. What would hamra'a be then? This is biyad. That must be b'kli. And that proves Rav Chisda, and it's a tiyuvta de Rav Huna, because he didn't think that was the distinction. He thought that hamra'a was lemakom she'ena yichola lachzir. It was all the way down. But we just explained that that's mahalkatim. So Amar l'cha Rav Yehuda la'olam mahalkatim desafi lebiyadayim. Really, mahalkatim is you shove it down the throat, but not all the way down the throat, just into the mouth. And then malkitim is deshadele kamayu. Malkitim is you just put the food in front of him. Then what was our question? Lemishta kamayu namilo. Right? What about the fact that we can't just throw the food in front of them? Why not? That's very simple. Hani mizonot halecha. Hani emizonot halecha. You can't feed animals that you're not responsible for. You can't even put food out in front of them. Big question comes up on Shabbat Shira. Shabbat Shira, there's a minhag because of Shirat Hayam. There was some custom developed about feeding birds. How do they feed birds on Shabbat? It's a very good question. So now they say Keditanya, notnim mizonot lifnei kelev, ve'ein notnim mizonot lifnei chazir. As it says in the Braita, you can give food to a dog, but not to a chazir. So, ma hefresh ben zeh lezeh, what's the difference? Zeh mizonot havalecha, ve'zeh em mizonot havalecha. A dog you're responsible to feed, a pig you're not. And why is that? We're going to see later in the Gemara. The Gemara is going to say pigs eat anything, and therefore it's very easy for them to get food. We don't actually mean a dog that's your own dog. We mean even a dog on the street you're allowed to feed, because the assumption is dogs won't be able to find food on their own, and therefore you're responsible to feed them. This reminds me of people who feed cats on the street. It seems like it, and we're going to see the story later. And to me, in my mind, I thought of all the cats that people feed, and we'll get back to it. Amar Rav Ashi, Manita Nami Daika. We can also see this from the Mishnah, because what does it say? You can't put water out in front of bees and in front of birds. But notice it doesn't say you can't put food out. You can't put water in front of the other animals. My time is what's the difference between the water that you're not allowed to put out for the bees and the birds, and you can put them out for ones that are in your house? The obvious difference is that those you're responsible for and those you're not. So then they say, but wait, but now we're going to focus on what I said just a minute ago, that there it says you can't put water out, but you can put, seems, wheat and barley. You can even feed them, and maybe that's where we get to. You can feed birds. You can feed them things like that. What's the reason? So why that? Water is found very easily, so they can get water anytime they want. So we now have, number one, if it's your own animal, you can definitely feed it. Number two, if it's an animal that needs you because it can't find food on its own, then you can also feed it. And that explains why there's a difference between the dogs and the pigs. Darash Rav Yona, and that explains how we explain that source according to Rav Yehuda, and how it's not a contradiction for his opinion. Darash Rav Yona apitcha de Nesia. He was giving a drasha on the entrance of the Nesi's house. My dachtiv yodat tzaddik din dalim. A tzaddik knows how to treat poor people. Well, the darshan is not about a tzaddik, but about Hashem. Yodat kadosh baruch hu bekelev. Okay, God knows about the poor dog's house. So shemazonotav muatim. He knows it's very hard for dogs to get food. He keeps the food. It takes 3 days for the food to digest, so that the food can keep him going longer. Kiditnan, as it says in the following Mishnah. Here we have an interesting halacha that comes out of this. If you have a dog that eats, let's say he bites the flesh of a person, he ends up with, let's say there's a dead person, he eats the flesh of the dead person. Now what happens? So while the dead person is inside him, his body blocks the tumor from coming out because it's swallowed up in the animal. But if he dies, then there's no longer, everything in his body is not viewed as swallowed up inside. And therefore, if you're there with the meat, the flesh of the body is still intact, if it's in a house, it's mitame everything in the house. It has tumat mate to it. So now, how many days? They say 3 days because the assumption is it takes 3 days for it to digest. But for a bird and fish, it's the amount of time that it takes to fall into a fire and be burned, which is very quick because their food digests much quicker. So the reason is it's God showing his mercy on the dog because he knows the dog has trouble finding food. We can learn from this. You should try to give meat to a dog. V'kama, how much? Amar of Mary, mashach odnei. You should do the amount to fill in, I think it's to fill an ear, if I remember correctly, something about an ear. Ma'at kimut ozno, right, like his ear, okay? Give him a little bit of food. And then take your stick, okay, and you should hit him with your stick immediately after so that the dog doesn't come back for more. Because if the dog comes back for more, you're going to be out of food. The dog's just going to chase you down forever. So now they say, Hane Mele B'Dabra. This is only in the desert, by the way. Aval B'Mata, in the city, lo, Ta'ata L'Misrach. If you do this in the city, and this is where I was thinking of the cats will never leave you, right? And likewise the dog. They will come back every single day if you start feeding them, and they'll know where to come to. If you're out in the desert, they won't know where to find you. You're going to move on to another place. But if you're at home, don't even give them one piece of meat because they'll never stop bothering you, and you'll be feeding them for the rest of your life. I guess what the concern is that it'll end up affecting them. It's one thing to feed the dog, it's important, but if they take all your food away, it's going to be a problem. Amra Papa. Leita anya mikalba v'leita atir michazira. Okay, another line connected to what we said before. There's no one more poor than a dog or more rich than a chazir. In other words, the dog has the least choice of foods around, and the pig will eat anything and therefore can really manage to eat anything. Or they say maybe people feed the pigs also. Tanya Kavatei de Rav Yehuda. Now we're going to bring a braita to support Rav Yehuda's reading. Remember, that's ein ma'amirin is makom she'ena yochal lachzir, all the way down through your throat. and mal'itin, and that you can't do, but you can put food down the makam shechol achzir. You can put it in their mouth where they can spit it out. Ezohi hamra'a ve'ezohi halata. According to this Braita, it'll support Rav Yehuda. Hamra'a marbitza u'pokeset piyah u'machila karshinin u'mayim bevat achat. You can put him on the ground, push him down, open his mouth, put the food in, you put in the vetch, and then you pour water, because when you pour the water, what's going to happen? It's going to flush the vetch down the throat. Halata, it sounds a little unpleasant. Interesting, they don't talk about tsar ba'alei chayim here. Maybe because ultimately you're doing something that's good for the animal. I'm not sure. Halata, what's that? Machila me'umad, the animal standing up. Umashke me'umad, you give it drink while it's standing. V'notzim karshinim b'fnei atzmam, umayim b'fnei atzmam. You give them some vetch, you give them some water, not all at the same time, which means you're not washing it down the throat. It's not going all the way down. Mahalkatim l'tarnagolim. You can do this force feeding to the tarnagolim in the way of halkata. Then it said, the real part that we want to deal with is you could put mayim in the morsan, the water into the bran. So Amar Abaye, Marita Kamedima, Madniti Mane. I said, who is this Mishnah like? I asked Rabba. Bar is always Rabba to Abaye. Amar li Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda's opinion. Titania, as it says in the Braita, Echad noten hakemach ve'echad noten mayim hacharon chayav. If one person puts in the flour, the next person puts in the water. The one who put in the water is obligated for kneading, even if he didn't actually knead it. That's Divrei Rebbe. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda Omer eno chayav ad shikabel. Until you knead it, you're not responsible. Dilma, so what do you see? It doesn't matter. As long as you don't do gibel, even if it thickens on its own, it's fine. But then they say no. There's a difference between water into morsan, into the bran, and water into flour. Why? Dilma, kanu kama Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda hatam ela kemach de bar gibelu. The flour is something that needs kneading. What happens? We all know when you make bread, you have to knead it. It changes the texture. But aval morsan de la bar gibelu. But there, just putting it in thickens it already. There's no more thickening that's going to happen to it by mixing it. Therefore, maybe afilu Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda modeh. Maybe he would agree that it's forbidden just to put the water because that in itself thickens it. It's like oatmeal. So they say, lo sakadatach. No, not necessarily. We know this isn't the case. Titania Behedia, it says explicitly in a Braita, ein no nimayim lemorsan, divrei Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda omer, no nimayim lemorsan. There we see explicitly in a Braita that they do disagree about this. Okay, last thing for today, I just want to remind you that we're going to stop here for now. But if you're not going to do the daf with me on Sunday, make sure to get to the Mishnah on Kuf Nun Zayin if you want to join the Siyum, because we're going to start from there. So if you want to finish the Masechet with us, start from the Mishnah. If you're not finishing the Masechet, you're also invited to come. If you know people who haven't finished, I assume if you're listening to today, you'll be finished. Or if you miss some pages maybe, don't worry. Join the Siyum. Come be part of it. It's not only about finishing. It's about being looking back and saying, wow, look at all I did, even if you didn't necessarily finish everything. Okay, we're going to stop here for today. Shabbat shalom or Shavua tov to everybody.